Namo Om Vishnupadaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutale Srimate Sridhardev Goswami Niti Namane Om Ajnanatimarandasya Gyananjana Shalakaya Chakshurun Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Namo Om Vishnupadaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutale Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swami Niti Namane Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Pashkatya Deshatarine. Om Shri Guru Bhyo Namaha. Jai Shriman Narayana. Very good. All right. Wonderful. Well, again, welcome everyone to the second session of the Narada Bhakti Sutras class. So for those who were here last time, you know we went through the first 3 verses. And as I said, we will probably only have time to go through another 3 verses or so. And actually that works out very, very nicely. First of all, actually, can everyone hear me, both in Connecticut and Austin? Very good. Okay.
Yes.
This works out very nicely because, as you can see by looking, these 3 verses are a unit. Namaste. Welcome. These 3 verses go together very nicely. They are a set unit. And in a short time, I'll talk about exactly how they are a set unit. If you look at these verses, what you'll see is that they all start off the same way. And let me explain what the pattern is very specifically. With the previous verses, we talked about a definition of bhakti, of devotional consciousness. We began with first the challenge that Narada throws down to us, and that is that having gone through so much previously, both material and spiritual, now is the time to inquire into bhakti. And then he gives a definition of bhakti. So having now done the definition, what we're going to do now is Narada begins to apply bhakti to us very specifically. All right? So what you'll see with these 3 verses, and I'll tell you beforehand so it's not a surprise, so you'll be ready for this. With verse 4, what he does is he explains what is bhakti in relationship to liberation. And you'll see these are sequential. One leads to the other and leads to the next. Now, having done that, with verse 5, he talks about devotional consciousness, or bhakti, in relation to our position in the material world and how we then act in the material world having attained liberation. And then, finally, with verse 6, he talks about the most important thing, and that is having achieved liberation through bhakti, having come to a stage in which we are living in the world in such a way that we are expressing bhakti. He then, in verse 6, explains how we are living in basically a realm of sweetness through bhakti and the relation of bhakti to that state of experiencing spiritual sweetness. All right? So that's what we're going to see in these next 3 verses, 4, 5, and 6. So with that, let's go on to verse 4. I'll first just read this to everyone, and then I'll comment a little bit. So, having attained that bhakti, that devotional consciousness, a person realizes his perfection and becomes blissfully liberated and at peace. All right? So we see how this is a moksha verse. Again, what Narada Muni is doing here is he's talking about devotional consciousness in relationship to liberation. All right? So what he is saying is that, of course, with bhakti, with devotional consciousness, we have liberation. And what does that look like? Because again, you've heard me say this many times, people who have been to my classes, when it comes to the concept of liberation, unfortunately, most people, including a lot of people who are actually very knowledgeable, have a very general, very generic, very hazy sort of idea about what is meant by liberation. It's Tathagata. It's simply going to that realm, as they would say in Buddhism, Tathagata. But that's it. And then it's a mystery after that. Well, liberation means something. It looks like something. So in this verse, he begins to give just a very, very brief synopsis of what this looks like. So let's go through this. So, having attained that devotional consciousness, a person realizes his perfection. Now let's stop there. He realizes his perfection. Again, you've heard me say this also. Perfection is a dirty word today. It scares people. When we think of perfection, we tend to have the wrong idea of perfection, that what it means is modeling ourselves perfectly after someone else, trying to achieve someone else's standards, etc. But we know spiritually that's not what perfection means. What perfection means, and this leads back to the previous verses, and especially this word, rupam, that we talked about very in depth. What perfection means is coming to perfection as we are ourselves, as an individual and unique personality. More than this, what does perfection mean in the spiritual context? Not just the individual context, but specifically the context of spiritual personality. What is meant by perfection is not something that is quantitative, because again, when we tend to think about perfection, what do we think of? Good, better, best. We tend to think of quantity. That, okay, well, what is perfection? It means, well, all right, my IQ, let's say, is 120. I'll make it 130. Oh, I'll make it 150. Oh, I'll make it 10,000. We tend to think quantity. Whatever is that attribute that I want to bring to its perfection, oh, let me just add to it, add to it, add to it. Oh, I have beauty up to a certain degree. Let me make that 5 times more, 10 times more, 100 times more. And you see where I'm going. Any positive attribute that we can think to ourselves about, we tend to think that what perfection means is take that attribute and just expand it, expand it, expand it. That is not what is meant by perfection in the spiritual context. Now, interestingly, quantity follows quality, so certainly that does occur to some limited extent, but that's not the deeper meaning of perfection. Rather, what is meant, of course, is a qualitative perfection. In other words, what is perfection? Everything being brought to its natural state, spiritually. That is perfection. That is perfection. Now, envision. Most of us were raised in the Judeo-Christian context. All right. So most of us, have had Christmas trees or experienced Christmas trees at some point. Well, we know that there are artificial Christmas trees that are very easy to set up. You can buy some very expensive ones where they look perfect. They look perfect. Not one pine needle will fall off, etc. And you pay a lot of money for them. You can get some that are silver. You can get all sorts of different colors. But then there's a real tree. And what is the difference? The difference is that with the artificial tree, does it look perfect? Well, yes. It looks perfect. In some ways, maybe it could even look better than a natural tree, but it's not a tree. It's not a tree. It's like that artist Magritte. Magritte? Interesting surrealist artist. And he had this famous painting where, I forget the French, but in English it says something like, "This is not a pipe, this is not an apple." He had a whole series. Do you remember that? The surrealist artist, where he would have a picture of an apple and then underneath it would say, "This is not an apple." And what was the point? It was not an apple. It was a painting of an apple. You see, it made you think. So this artist Magritte was quite good at this. In the same way, when you see an artificial tree, are you seeing, let's say, a perfect tree? No. Even though it may, in some ways, even look better than a natural tree. It's not a tree. It's not a tree. It didn't grow in nature. It's not something that will have a natural fragrance all throughout your house, etc. Instead, you want that natural tree. And that is actually perfect. More perfect than the artificial tree, even though to our eyes, the artificial tree, might look better and it's more convenient. But it's not a tree. It's not a tree. In the same way, what it means to achieve perfection is not just the $6 million man like Superman. Oh, now suddenly I can run faster, I can jump higher, No, it's not quantity. It's rather bringing yourself back to your perfect, natural, spiritual state. That is perfection. That is perfection. So that's the first thing that we are to understand. So, having attained bhakti, a person realizes his perfection and becomes blissfully liberated. All right, this is the key clause here, is that bhakti leads to liberation, but more, what kind of liberation? And again, when I translated this, I did my best to really stick very close to the original wording. Blissfully liberated, you see. Not a somber liberation, not a stoic liberation, not a liberation where, oh, now we feel nothing, we experience nothing. Not a liberation in which we merge into a Brahman and become literally one with Brahman and lose the ability to be an experiencer experiencing the object of experience. Because by definition, to be blissful means you must have those three elements. That you are an experiencer experiencing an object of experience. Thus, by definition, to experience bliss in the state of liberation, we cannot become quite literally God. We cannot literally absorb ourselves in God and lose ourselves. Thus, with the inclusion of this one little word, it is explained that it's a blissful liberation. We are experiencing something, and we are experiencing necessarily an other. As a result of which, of proximity of which, we are thus experiencing liberation. Thus, we are experiencing blissful liberation. We are blissfully liberated and at peace. At peace. What is meant by at peace? Is it fun when I just throw out a word at you and then, of course, we can talk about this for an hour? What is meant by at peace? Do we think we know what that means? What is peace? The absence of war? Is it just a negation? No one is hitting me right now that I'm aware of, so I must be at peace. It's not simply a negation. What is meant by at peace within this spiritual context? It means now fulfillment is there, the deepest fulfillment. Why are we not at peace? At any given time, why do we find ourselves not at peace? We're not fulfilled. We're not fulfilled. Even if it is a not at peace so subtle to the point where it's just that ennui, it's just that subtle angst that is there, gnawing at us, at the very back of our minds, in our subconscious, unconscious realm. Even if it's that little unpeace that consciously we may not even be aware of, but it's there nonetheless. Why do we experience that? Because we're not fulfilled. Because we have a little bit of fear. Fear that, well, anything can happen at any time. That's the nature of this world. Fear that we're going to lose something, etc., etc. You've heard me say all this before. So, that is what is not being at peace. What is at peace? What does this mean in a spiritual context? It means that we have that fulfillment. It means that, again, now having achieved that liberation, we are experiencing bliss. Actually, let me back up. Having now experienced liberation as a result of bhakti, we are now experiencing bliss because we have met that object that we've been searching for. And we have that fulfillment. In other words, what this is explaining, again, in code, is we have now come into the presence of God. This is Narada. This is Narada. All right, let's go on to verse 5. And again, these three verses are nice because they start off in the same way, and there's a reason why. They are a unit. Having attained to that devotional consciousness, that bhakti, he desires nothing material, does not know grief, does not hate, and does not rejoice or express enthusiasm in material activities. So again, this previous verse, verse 4, talks about bhakti in relation to we as the yogi, as a being having attained liberation. Isn't that interesting? It starts with liberation. But now it's describing how the liberated person who is still operative within the world, how they look, what they are like, what they are experiencing. Okay? Does that make sense? All right, we're on the path. We're practicing bhakti yoga. We achieve the goal. We become liberated. Doesn't mean you leave. Doesn't mean you leave your body. No, no, no. There's jivan mukta. You can still be within the body, operating in the world, but you're liberated. Now, with this next verse, this is what this is describing. What this person looks like, who is still operating in the world, but inwardly they are a liberated being. All right, so let's look at this now. He desires nothing material. All right, well, that's obvious. That's a given. He desires nothing material. What is meant by that? He now, of course, has experienced the spiritual. He has experienced the spiritual in a very vivid way. Now, that being the case, if you, throughout your life, have never seen a forest, but you've always seen paintings of forests. You've never actually seen a forest, but you've always seen paintings of forests. And then one day, someone grabs you, brings you to a forest, and you breathe in, and you breathe that scent of nature, and you look around, and you hear everything, you're experiencing everything. And as you're experiencing all this, someone comes up to you and is carrying a big picture of nature. Hey, don't forget this. What will you do? You'll kind of look at it and say, oh, get that away from me. I don't need that anymore. Look, I'm in nature. I'm in a forest. In the same way, once we have achieved that liberation and we have experienced the spiritual, now the material means nothing to us. Now, going back to that analogy, the person brings you that painting of the forest when you're in the forest. You will now see the difference. You will no longer need that painting, but will you burn the painting? No. Will you spit at the painting? No, no. You still appreciate, okay, well, no, that is a nice painting. That's a good painting, yes. However, I'm in the forest. I don't need it. But it's a nice painting. In the same way, of course, what I'm trying to say is we don't artificially denounce the material world. It's not that we no longer appreciate it. We appreciate it. We operate within it. The material world still has its importance. It's just that now we have seen the real. In comparison to which the imitation is nothing. We appreciate the imitation. We'll even say, oh, it's a good imitation. But I'm in the forest. I'm in the spiritual. All right? That person does not know grief. That person does not know grief. Grief. As I was just saying a moment ago. We experience grief all the time, whether it's in the form of just anxiety that wears away at us, whether it's in the form of actual physical pain that occurs in a myriad of ways. There are probably hundreds of thousands of ways that we can experience physical grief, whether it's loss, whether it's anything we can think of. I always have to remind people of this, especially the New Age crowd. The Buddha made this very clear. The core of his teaching is this world is suffering. That was his teaching. Not the world is laughter and light. He didn't say the world is laughter and light. He said the world is suffering. That's what this world is. It is a world of grief. Oh, is it a world of happiness and pleasure too? Obviously, yes. Of course, it goes back and forth, like the winter and summer seasons. However, it's the grief, of course, that we remember. We're geared to that way genetically. That it's the grief, especially, that we want to avoid even more so than we want to hurl ourselves toward the pleasurable. It is a world of grief in which we experience grief all the time. We lose people we love, etc. You get the idea. But imagine being in such a state, in your consciousness, not in a place. You see, we're still in this place. Keep in mind, this liberated being who has achieved liberation through bhakti is still within the material world, but inwardly, the grief is gone. Does that mean that now that they're a liberated being, no relatives or friends die anymore? No, they still do. Does it mean that a liberated being, as he's walking through a beautiful forest and he's looking up, is not going to once in a while stumble over a branch or a really big root and fall down and hurt himself a little bit? Of course, that will still happen. So the causes of grief will still be there, but the resultant grief will not. The causes of grief will still be there, but the resultant grief will not for that person who is liberated. That person does not hate. There's this famous verse in Bhagavad Gita where Krishna is explaining to Arjuna that for the sage, they see all living beings for who they truly are, whether it is a brahmana, whether it is a cow, whether it is a dog, whether it is any other being, whether it is an outcast, whether it is literally a subhuman, an outcast. They understand that when they are viewing all these different beings, while externally they have different appearances, and that has to be acknowledged, as I've said, no, we're not going to marry the dog, not going to marry the cow. We have to respect the laws of this world, of empirical reality. But at the same time, that person has what? What the Bhagavad Gita says, samadarshinaha. They look beyond the body and they see all beings as being Atman. That being the case, hatred, that is a materialistic sort of hatred where you see the other as the enemy, simply does not exist for the liberated being. Now, at the same time, this is tricky because, again, as I was saying, even the liberated being has respect for the fact that we are living in an empirical material reality. Thus, is the liberated being, while they don't hate for the wrong reason, that is, it's not motivated by envy, by lust, by anger, etc., by greed, would you say that it is the case then that the liberated being cannot distinguish an enemy from a friend? Of course they can. Of course they can. They can understand, all right, this is an individual who is a friend. This is someone who is a good person. This is someone who is a spiritual person, etc. Oh, look, over the ridge is coming an army of individuals who want to come, descend upon us, and kill us all. That is the enemy. This is how the liberated person is thinking. That is the enemy. It is an enemy, unfortunately, of Atmans, eternal spirit souls, just like me, who, unfortunately, are presently in illusion, occupying bodies that are hurtling toward me, wanting to kill me. You see? But the liberated being still acknowledges this. This is an enemy, we must defeat them. So again, acknowledging the spiritual and material reality at the same time, not just one or the other. However, this is the important thing, and this is what is meant by the liberated being does not hate. As the enemy is hurtling toward them, and as even the liberated being perhaps will carry a sword and go after them and even kill them, the liberated being knows this is very unfortunate that in their ignorance they are attacking me thinking I'm their enemy, because they are really liberated souls. So again, that coming together of the spiritual and the material, simultaneously. Of course, what do we see in the material world? People tend to veer toward one or the other. We have the gross materialists who feel, well, all we are bodies. These people are different. They are the other. They are the enemy, and that's all they are. But then you have people who go to the opposite extreme. And forgive me for being repetitive, but these are the New Age people. Everyone is spiritual. Thus, there is no enemy. Thus, there is no difference between us. Thus, there is nothing material. We shouldn't even look at the material. We shouldn't look at reality, material reality. So the two extremes. And of course, they're both wrong. The liberated being acknowledges both. That we are spiritual beings presently having a material experience, traversing this material world in such a manner that in our illusion, we of course want to kill each other. That is the state of living beings in this world in their illusion. And the liberated being acknowledges this and lives accordingly. But Everything they do, of course, they do their best, they do their utmost to express compassion. Let's go a little bit deeper. And that person does not rejoice or express enthusiasm in material activities. Very good. So now it's talking about more how you can recognize such a liberated being. This is how you, let's say, this is how the non-liberated being will recognize the liberated being. That when you meet the liberated being, you will be meeting someone who is living within the world but cares nothing for it, who is not motivated in the same way that 99.999% of other human beings are. So that's what this little clause, this last clause is doing. It's showing us how you know whether you're meeting a liberated being. The way that you know is because you will meet someone who, while everyone else is rejoicing and enthusiastic about their material acquisitions, checking the stock market every day, checking to see how their stocks are doing, and kind of subtly trying to show off, well, hey, did you see the new car I got? Isn't it great? And hey, don't you like these new clothes? I got this at such and such place, etc. And just reveling in what they have. The liberated being revels in what they are, not instead. So rather than reveling merely in what we have, we should revel. We should be blissful in who we are, who we, of course, truly are as eternal spiritual beings. So this is how you know that person when you meet them. You are meeting someone for who. What does this mean? You're going to meet someone who's naked and who owns nothing? Who doesn't eat? No, of course not. Of course not. You will meet someone who has all the basics of life, but you will meet someone who is, and I'm using this word very purposefully, incorruptible. You're meeting someone who is incorruptible when you meet a liberated being. You're meeting someone who cannot be bribed by money. You're meeting someone who cannot be bribed by some donor saying, oh, I'll give you $1 million if you'll give me initiation, even though really I want to go on eating meat and I want to go on doing what I'm doing and smoking my cigars and et cetera, but I would like initiation from you anyway. So I'll give you $1 million if you'll give me initiation. See, it's interesting. People tried that with Prabhupada. I remember, I can't think of his name. I wish I could. There was an Indian man in Mumbai, actually, very wealthy, industrialist. And he actually said I remember seeing the video of an interview with him. And he actually said, oh, when I first met Prabhupada, I wasn't sure because I had met so many swamis. So in little ways, subtle ways, I tried appealing to his greed. I tried offering him donations and he wasn't interested. He just spoke to me the way he spoke to anyone else, even though he knew I had millions and millions of dollars. He treated me the way he treated any of his disciples. He always told me the truth, whether I wanted to hear it or not. And of course, this person ended up indeed taking initiation from Prabhupada. Again, I'm sorry I can't remember his name. But that's how you know whether someone is real. That you can't bribe them. They are literally incorruptible. They will leave this world not having given in an inch to materialism in any way. Let's go on to the last verse that we're going to look at today. And that is verse 6. Having realized that devotional consciousness, that bhakti, he becomes blissfully intoxicated in it. He becomes stunned in ecstasy and is fully satisfied in his true spiritual self, his Atma. So again, very nice progression where we see that first it talks about liberation, and all right, we can achieve liberation through bhakti, and what does that look like when we see such a being in the material world? But now we're going a little deeper. What is that being who is liberated experiencing within? And this is what they're experiencing. He becomes blissfully intoxicated in it, in bhakti. This is very important. This is actually very important. You remember last time we spoke about this, and I've spoken about this before as well, about how bhakti yoga, but bhakti itself is not merely a means. It is the goal. It is not merely a path, a quote-unquote path. It's not merely a yoga. But after the yoga is done, after you've achieved liberation, you still experience bhakti. Bhakti is the goal. Bhakti is our natural state of consciousness. Again, this is why I purposefully translate it this way. Devotional consciousness, that is bhakti. So what is this one clause here saying? The liberated being becomes blissfully intoxicated in bhakti. So again, that the person is still experiencing bhakti. It's not that they leave it behind as a raft that I no longer need now that I'm liberated, but more than this. Now that bhakti is coming to its full fruition, where they are experiencing bliss as a result of that bhakti within their liberated state. You remember earlier we talked about how in liberation you experience bliss, but more, and now it's going even more specific, where it's saying that bliss itself, in fact, is bhakti. It's not just that you're experiencing a generic bliss, you know, if you can imagine such a thing. Oh, I was miserable, and then I found myself walking down the street, and then suddenly a bliss bubble came and you know, it engulfed me, and for no reason I'm now experiencing bliss. No, that's not what happens. If you are blissful for a reason. If you're miserable for a reason. Well, in this particular case, what of course is being said is that bhakti itself is non-distinct, non-different from the bliss of liberation that we experience. And it's an ongoing interaction that we experience, a deepening and deepening interaction that we experience within the context of bhakti that gives us that bliss, where it just interacts. We have more bhakti, we have more bliss. We have more bliss, we want more bhakti. And it goes on that way, deeper and deeper and deeper, in depth, qualitatively, plunging as deep into this ocean as we possibly can. That is the state of liberation. And of course, in relationship with God. We're not in a vacuum. We're not in a vacuum. He becomes stunned in ecstasy. Stunned. That's that's pretty interesting statement. It's interesting how throughout the history of Sanatana Dharma, again and again, you will find sages who indeed exhibit this divine state, where they quite literally will appear to external sources as if they are stunned in bliss. I've told you how Prabhupada would do this once in a while. My guru would do this once in a while. In the literature, there are many, many sages who it will say that they are in such bliss that they literally will just become motionless. They can become motionless in any context. During a kirtan, giving a talk, they can be walking and suddenly just become motionless to the point where, in many cases, they will literally stop breathing. You can put a mirror up to them and there's no breath, and yet they're standing there. This has been experienced historically. They are stunned in ecstasy, meaning what? That at certain points, the spiritual has so perfectly encroached upon the material such that the material not only becomes secondary, it becomes non-existent at that moment for the liberated sage. They are still within their body, but the body stops. They're not dead. On the contrary, they're still very much living. But for a short time, the material world for them ceases as they are perfectly communing with that divine. And it can be a few seconds, it can be a few minutes, it can be a few hours. It's an amazing state if you have not experienced it. And that person is fully satisfied, Atma Rama, in his true spiritual self. In the Bhagavatam, it describes this state as Atmarama. Atmarama, meaning satisfaction in self, true self. Satisfaction in oneself, meaning that at that stage you have grasped yourself perfectly, spiritually. You know how we've talked about this, about how liberation really occurs in two stages. First there's self-realization, then there's God-realization. First there's self-realization, Atma-jnana, and then there is God consciousness, or Brahma-vidya. However, what is interesting is, having now achieved God consciousness, even one's understanding of self increases more and more. So it's interesting how this may sound strange. Even in, let's say, basic generic Atma-jnana or self-realization, you do not realize yourself perfectly. Why? Because in self-realization, you have realized yourself for what you are, but not the extent of what you are. You have realized, I am this, I am not that. You have logically, factually experienced and realized who you are in basic self-realization. But it is only in connection with the divine, who is the source of your very self, that now you have the ability to enter deeper into what are the further dimensions of that self, the deeper dimensions of that self. Many examples are given. If you've never tasted honey, a scientist, can explain to you all the properties of honey. You can even have a honey jar in front of you, and you're looking at it, and okay, it's brown, and the jar is closed, but it looks thick, etc., etc. All right, you understand what honey is. You understand what honey is not. Okay, well, honey is not blue, I guess. Honey is not clear, it has a color. Honey is not a cow. Honey is not a building, You understand what honey is and honey is not, what honey is not, correct? But do you really understand honey? Why not? You have to take off the top of that jar, and you must now taste. Now you are truly understanding the depths of what honey is, the quality of what honey is, the experience, the true experience of honey. So in the same way, it is only in connection with the divine that we go beyond even basic self-realization. Now with God consciousness, we can explore that self to its deepest degrees, to its deepest extent. And again, this goes on forever. And more, it goes on forever, and what multiplies exponentially that experience is the very fact that we are exploring ourselves, not just, again, in a vacuum, but we are exploring ourselves in reciprocity, in interaction with that which is the self of ourself, with that which is our source. Thus, the exploration, the extent of the exploration is unimaginable. Very good. For lack of time, let's stop there. We finished these 3 verses. Plus, I want to see just for a few minutes if there are any questions. But those are the 3 verses for today, chapter 1, verses 4, 5, and 6. Talking about the liberated state in bhakti. What that is like, how that is experienced, what that looks like to others when they are experiencing a liberated being. And how ultimately, the most important thing is that experience of bliss. Please.
You said that when you become absorbed in devotional bliss, you don't become one with God, because the blissfulness implies that there's an object of your bliss.
You don't lose yourself in God, yes.
You don't lose yourself in God. But isn't God supposed to be in a continual state of bliss himself?
Mm-hmm. Yes, his own bliss. Yes. Right now, there is a person behind this temple who is in a continuous state of bliss. That's nice. Unless we're experiencing that, that's nice. But don't we want to experience bliss? So the fact that God is in a, and I'll answer your question a little bit more philosophically. The fact that God is is in a constant and infinite state of bliss, that certainly is true. That is good, but we still, as beings who have our own experiential locus, we want to experience our own bliss as well, number one. Number two, it is God's bliss in and of itself that is in fact the source of even our bliss and all bliss experienced by all beings. Because again, being our source, if we were to trace back, okay, what is the origin of what we are experiencing? Again, the experience in and of itself of bliss, if we could see it as a Shakti, as a power, as something that is living, that would be the very bliss that God is experiencing. Almost like Platonic forms. That the reason why we can conceive of a perfect chair is because there is a perfect chair in the Platonic realm of forms. Well, of course, that even using Plato, that's an extremely imperfect example. Why is it that we are experiencing bliss? Because God is. Yes, but ultimately we are experiencing our own bliss as experiencers, as units of perspectival units of consciousness. We also must experience bliss as well. Does that make sense? All right. Any questions in Skype world? Austin, Connecticut. Are we all satisfied? Yes, please. And maybe come very close and speak very loud.
You've said before Patanjali's Yoga Sutras are a treatise on self-realization, and we're talking about bhakti, devotional consciousness, but this also is seeming to me as we go into it, it's a window into Brahma Vidya. Not so much necessarily as a manual, but and I didn't know if that would be, if there's a more correct way to think of that or to have that explained or described.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly right, actually. Yes, so again, of the two goals of liberation, Atma Jnana, or self-realization, and then Brahma Vidya, or God consciousness, the Yoga Sutras deals almost exclusively with self-realization. It doesn't deal with God consciousness, just self-realization. Narada Bhakti Sutras and the Shandilya Bhakti Sutras, another book, deal with God consciousness. Yes. So they deal with the higher step, the second step of liberation. Yes, that's exactly what this book is about. Yeah. And in fact, really in the order of Shandilya Bhakti Sutras and Narada Bhakti Sutras. Narada Bhakti Sutras goes much deeper than Shandilya Bhakti Sutras. And that's why we, like with this last verse, we're even going a step beyond just God consciousness and kind of going back then a little bit to self and how is self interacting with God and experiencing God consciousness. So yes, this is why I've explained to people Narada Bhakti Sutras is pretty much as deep as it gets spiritually when it comes to Shastra, when it comes to scriptures. Good? Very good. One more question. Excellent question. This may surprise you. They do get tired of the material world. They actually do. This is why, for example, my guru's guru, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, he's famous for making the statement that this material world is no place for a gentleman. he actually said that. Great statement. Yes, even in the state of liberation, actually, they recognize the fact that while inwardly they are really thoroughly operating on the spiritual level, they still have to interact, of course, with beings who who are in Maya, who are in illusion. And it's not so much that they mind, it's the fact that, in fact, let me tell you what they mind. They mind, it's a very personal thing. What they mind is just the fact that they feel, and it's not true, but they feel that their attention is divided and they regret that they cannot give 100% of their attention just to serving God. So it's a very personal sentiment that they have. That's where the dissatisfaction comes from. So it's not a material dissatisfaction. It's not, a dissatisfaction because, oh, it's so inconvenient being here. No. They're thinking to themselves, oh yes, while here, of course, there are necessarily distractions. Even if you're liberated, there are necessarily distractions. What? Oh, the body's ill? You're not the body, and it doesn't really affect you. It's just a distraction. And the regret is, I don't want distractions. I want my consciousness thoroughly focused upon the divine, serving the divine, without break, without interruption. This is why it's interesting. I'll stop here because we should go on with Guru Purnima. And the story of the gopis. And for those who don't know, and Narada later will talk about the nature of the gopis. The gopis were the greatest bhaktas. The gopis were the greatest liberated yogis. They were the greatest liberated beings, the greatest sages, the greatest saints. They achieved the highest of all goals that Narada is talking about, pure devotional consciousness toward God. And of course, what were they? They were young girls, to the surprise of everyone. They weren't, these impressive-looking yogis in robes or anything. They were young girls who were in love with Krishna. But that's who the gopis were. But it's funny how at one point, just to express the sentiment that I was just explaining to you, the gopis began to rebuke Brahma, Brahma being the god of creation who creates everything, and just kind of in a joking way, but also meaning it. They were rebuking him, and they were saying, oh, Brahma, when you created us and you created these material forms, why did you have to give us eyes that blink? Because each time we blink, we can't see Krishna for that split second. Why did you have to do that to us? Imagine that. And this is exactly what I'm talking about. That is the source of the dissatisfaction. It's not, I don't like this about this world and that, and I have to take showers every day, and it's just a pain having material. No. It's the little things like that. That, here's Krishna before me, but, I have to blink. I don't even want to blink. That's how much I love God, that I'm viewing him. But I just blinked again. For that split second, I didn't see him. Yeah, so that's the dissatisfaction that the sage experiences. That's the nature of their God consciousness, their consciousness of the divine. It's inconceivable. It's literally inconceivable. We're dissatisfied about everything. We're dissatisfied about traffic. They're dissatisfied because, again, the little things of this world keep them from focusing 100% on God and serving God.